All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. I'm Jake, the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm very excited to introduce to our audience Christian scholar Dr. Joshua R. Farris. How are you doing today, Dr. Farris?
Hey, good to be with you, Jake. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure's all mine. So, guys, for those who are familiar with my channel, today I will be interviewing Dr. Farris on the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. Sure, you guys have heard me speak about it before, in sometimes a critical fashion, but I want to give a chance to expose the audience, whether Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, to sort of the intellectual side of Christianity, because they do have a lot to offer and very interesting things to say about these things. So I want to give a chance for people like Dr. Farris to come on here, share their thoughts and ideas, and have a good conversation. Hopefully, further the discussions as far as Muslim and Christian dialogue goes. So that's sort of my goal. Now, what I want to do is I want to familiarize the general audience more with some of these basic concepts. So we're going to go through them, and Dr. Farris is going to help us to try to understand some of these things. But for those who aren't familiar, I just want to introduce our guest. Dr. Joshua R. Farris is the Chester and Margaret Paluch Professor of Philosophical Theology. He's also a part-time lecturer at Auburn University Montgomery, Cranmer Theological House, and visiting fellow at the Center of Theological Inquiry. He was previously Assistant Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University in the Honors College and the Department of Philosophy. He has published over 30 articles in top-tier theology and philosophy journals, as well as several popular and wide circulating outlets. His primary areas of interest for research include philosophy of mind, interdisciplinary studies, theological anthropology, and systematic theology. So that's just a brief introduction to our guest, Dr. Farris. Now, Dr. Farris, do you have anything else to add as far as an introduction to yourself about, to the audience?
Yeah, that's all great. Thank you. I'm actually not, I was the Paluch professor last year at Mundelein Seminary, just to clarify that. This year I am the headmaster at Alpine Christian School.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So that works. So yeah, like I said, we're going to try to start simple as we can, and then we're going to progressively dive a little bit deeper into the doctrine of the Incarnation. So those who aren't familiar, Dr. Farris, just give us a brief explanation, if you could, as to what exactly the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation is.
Sure. Yeah. Let me give that, and let me preface it by saying that by confession, I am a Christian in the traditional or Catholic sense, that as it is espoused in the Nicene Creed, and as it's been carried along in Catholic Christianity. Christology is an area, I would say, of competence, but not an area of specialty for me. So I just want to make that clear up front. As we approach the doctrine of the Incarnation in particular, which we're talking about today, the doctrine of the Incarnation actually is something that is central, I think we would all say central to the Christian faith, something that we as Christians confess and must confess if we are to affirm or maintain the name of Christian. Why? Well, there's several things that and I know we're going to get into the philosophical discussions, the contemporary philosophical discussions in a moment. But by way of preface, in terms of the Christian sources of knowledge, theological sources of knowledge, particularly, of course, Scripture, the Old and New Testaments, as codified in either the Protestant canon or in the Anglo-Catholic canon with the Apocrypha. Either one, both seem to affirm quite clearly in their teaching, or point to, even early on in the Old Testament, to this view that say about who Christ is central to our confession of life and or to our confession itself and to our practicing confession, how it is that we live out our lives. So in Matthew 16:16, when it says, "But who do you say that I am?" that rather important question is central to the confessional stance that all Christians are called to make in both their verbally as well as in their life. So this is rather important. It's important also because, and we can talk about the different biblical data that seems to support this or affirm this doctrine, particularly John 1:1 and John 1:14. But it's also important because it has been codified and recognized by the Church Catholic in the Nicene Constantinople Creed, which all Christians take to be a definitive conciliar statement on the nature of God as a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of which Christ, the one who is the divine person become man, is central to that confession, and it's more clearly marked out in the Chalcedonian definition, which states that the Godhead, perfectly man and perfectly God, consists both of a divine nature and first a divine person that assumes a rational soul plus a body. And so Christ himself is consubstantial with the Father, God the Father in the Nicene Creed is spoken of, and clearly we profess in the Old Testament when we talk about the one true God in the Shema, and he is also identified as a human being, but first he is a divine person and one with a human nature. And this becomes really important to how it is that Christians articulate the mystery of the gospel that Paul talks about so much in the various letters of the New Testament, where he describes this mystery as one that is likened unto the union between male and female, or husband and wife, as being a pointer to, a signifier to the reality of Christ and his bride, which this incarnation, well, this is the mystery. This is the mystery. And when you look back at the old interpreters of Scripture, it's not just a philosophical matter, although it is that. It's an interpretive matter when we're reading the whole of the Old and New Testaments. So when Augustine in On Christian Teaching describes how it is that Christians read, not just Jewish people who read the Old Testament, but how it is that Christians read is they read with this hermeneutical lens of the divine infleshed being. And that is to permeate all of our reading about the Old and New Testaments as the kind of well, Augustine refers to it as the kind of the rule of faith that is the guide and guard of our interpretive process in the Scriptures. So it's really important where we veer from this dogmatically. It's a dogmatic truth that we must affirm both in the ecumenical statements as well as in our confessional statements. I come from a broadly reformed Anglican tradition. In our confessional statements in the Book of Common Prayer, we make it very clear that this is central dogma. It cannot be denied. If it is denied verbally or in practice, and there's various ways to think about that, then it leads to, or it is, a kind of heresy, a false teaching. And so this is obviously primarily, this is the big rub where Christians differ from other religious perspectives. So it's really key. But I would just add to that it's important to gaining a proper understanding of the Christian faith itself. And apart from it, there is no faith apart from the confession, the central confession of Christ as the God-man. I know we're just having a discussion here. My overall argument today, when we get into the more philosophical issues, is very modest. I don't anticipate persuading anyone of this truth. I would just say that if you accept the project of faith-seeking understanding, which we find in Augustine and somebody like Saint Anselm, then I would say that modestly what we're doing is not necessarily proving the doctrine of the Incarnation. That would be too strong, and I'm not inclined to think that I could do that. Nor am I saying that this particular way of working it out is the doctrine of the Incarnation or the truth. And you have some contemporary philosophers who want to make that stronger claim. And I think at best what our philosophy does for us is our philosophy provides us with potential ways of bringing together the data that's codified in the ecumenical statements like the Chalcedonian Statement in a way that gives us some access to or some way of making sense out of the data itself. And potentially it shows at least that there is a coherence, or it at least shows that there is not a clear contradiction in the claims that are made in the Chalcedonian Statement. So I just want to make that very qualified sort of claim, because I'm not trying to prove the truth of it. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, because, a lot of the stuff that I talk about on my channel has to do with very deep philosophical questions related to things like the Incarnation, Trinity, stuff like that.
Yes.
And a lot of people, because for at least my audience, something I noticed is it's new for a lot of people. So there's been a bit of criticism from both Muslim and Christian sides as to why we're even sort of engaged in this kind of exercise. So I'd like to know from you, what, in your experience, your expertise, what is analytic philosophy and what is the role that it's played in recent years as far as its relationship to Christian doctrines like the Incarnation or the Trinity, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So the analytic philosophy is the study of philosophy from a particular tradition or a particular way of doing philosophy, contrasted with commonly with the continental tradition, which you might argue we have a tradition that develops from within modernity or after certain modern philosophers like Husserl, Heidegger, and Hegel, who are motivating this long developed continental tradition of or way of doing philosophy that is rooted. Many of them, at least, are rooted in phenomenology first, or in some sort of what's called the hermeneutical tradition. And myself, I've been sort of grafted into and inculcated in what's called the analytic tradition of philosophy. And I'm not a staunch analytic. In other words, I think analytic is probably the best way to approach clarifying certain terms and concepts in the world. It does a better job than the continental tradition, although there are some days that I do think that the continentalist, phenomenologist in particular, have something to offer in terms of certain experiential data that's out in the world that's not always easy to reduce, certainly not easy to reduce to certain propositions or to clarified, sort of analytically precise concepts. But the analytic tradition, you might argue, follows or is motivated or began with, well, there's a couple of people who really motivated it, and Bertrand Russell is one common figure in the analytic tradition, who's an atheist, and of course, early on, the analytic tradition was done primarily by philosophers. And but what it bequeaths to us, arguably, its best work is seen in the works of people like Richard Swinburne, the Christian philosopher at Oxford, who's now an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And in his works, particularly in his analytic philosophy of religion works, he's spent a lot of time and contributed to the doctrine of the existence and nature of God. So he has a trilogy defending the existence of the Christian God and the nature of the Christian God. And then on the other side, well, let me mention a few others. Of course, there's a few others. There's the Reformed epistemologists like Alvin Plantinga, who have contributed a great deal to Christian philosophy of religion in particular. And of course, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who is an analytic religion. And what they offer at their best is just clarification of theological terms or terms that have been used by way of the dispositions of the sort of analytic philosophical categories. So it brings a certain rigor to Christian philosophy and theology. And so what birthed out of that is what's called, as you know, analytic theology, which there's not an easy sort of agreed upon definition of what analytic theology is, but there are shared, at least you might say, characteristics or habits or dispositions and tools that are commonly reflected amongst theologians who are thinking about their own tradition or within their own tradition by utilizing those analytic resources and drawing from the analytic literature, depending on what subjects they may be studying. So in my case, I studied analytic theology, and I focused particularly on theological anthropology, the study of the human being. And in so doing, I appropriated the tools of analytic philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. So some of the works that became particularly important to me in my sort of theological development from the analytic tradition included John Foster's works, some of his works like his Cartesian defense of the mind, and Richard Swinburne's The Evolution of the Soul, and then later on Mind, Brain, and Free Will became particularly important and informative. Of course, Alvin Plantinga's works and his argument for mereological replacement against materialism. And these sorts of things informed how I developed my thinking about the human being and human nature itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Farris, there are people that I've experienced, in conversation, whether it be Christian apologists or laymen, when I discuss some of these issues with them and even present material from Christian, scholars who are in the field, who are speaking about these things, such as yourself. Um, Sometimes the reaction is, well, why are they even engaged in this? Is this just sort of wide speculation? The concern is that it's not biblical or biblically based, and that we shouldn't really go beyond scripture or engage in these sort of practices. So what would you say as a Christian who is, broadly speaking, in the analytic tradition and does engage in this sort of material and write on these topics? What would you say to, your Christian critics or who may be critical of that sort of approach, that it's sort of just wild speculation or unbiblical?
Yeah. So, yeah. So there's a couple of things going on there that I think are important to draw attention to. In some sense, a part of me resonates with the objection a little bit, insofar as it seems to me that The biblical data as it stands, the biblical data seems to, when it's put together in any sort of logical or coherent fashion, in other words, when we're reading texts together in a broadly biblical theological manner, it seems to point quite strongly to this, what in some ways, at least historically, would have been considered a rather bizarre doctrine, that God could become man. And so when the framers of the various conciliar and creedal ecumenical statements of the Christian faith first framed and put together these statements about the nature of who God is and who Christ is centrally to the revelation of God, they themselves, while there's a whole history of biblical interpretation as well as philosophical work, which were not separated. And you can look to this book. This is a fantastic book on the guide to the literature, to the background literature to the various ecumenical statements on some of these issues. But you notice, like in those discussions, there is an understanding that when we start articulating the divine-human relationship, we are pointing to a mystery in some sense. It is a mystery, and so a part of me is sympathetic to those who are inclined to say that analytic philosophy tries too hard and tries too much to make sense of these rather very mysterious concepts that we nonetheless confessionally affirm in our faith. Another part of me looks at the tradition, the wider Christian tradition leading up to these ecumenical statements and post these ecumenical statements in the wider tradition. And it is very common, at least amongst the theological authorities, that I would point to and say these are thinkers that need to be wrestled with, and they need to be held in high authority. Not a high authority above the ecumenical statements or above the Bible, but higher authority than, say, my pastor or even my priest. They are all a part of this process of thinking through this mystery and trying to make sense of it both biblically as well as philosophically. So there's a dogmatic tradition that is part and parcel of the Christian. It's the Christian faith that we are trying to think out of, utilizing philosophical resources and biblical material to make some sense out of it. So this is fairly common. And in the Reformed tradition, you have the sort of scholastic reformers following from scholastic medieval theology, who are themselves also trying to make sense of and bring some sort of analytic precision to the mystery. So in many ways, the analytic tradition, the analytic theology today, I think it's been a good thing. It's helped in terms of bringing about some kind of renaissance or revival in contemporary theology and helping make things clearer than it otherwise was, even in recent history. I think what the analytic theological community is really doing, and they probably won't like me saying this, but they're in many ways, they're just kind of doing scholastic systematic theology. And I'm sympathetic to that project as well, because I think there is something to the faith-seeking understanding project of Anselm and Augustine, that we, as we work internal to our own faith, we are constantly in the process of trying to understand, and analytic tools, I think, can help with that or bring some sort of clarification to those concepts. And so I'm sympathetic to both lines. I think the mystery card can be thrown up too quickly.
Right.
And I think there's probably more that we can say than those who just say, this is what Chalcedon says, and there we have it. That's all we need. Good to go. I think there's certainly much more to say about that, not only within the broader dogmatic tradition post Chalcedon, but
Right.
also within sort of the contemporary philosophical or theological discussions that are taking place right now.
Mhm.
So that's what I would say. I would say at best, probably, we can, as analytic theologians, we can provide models, and we can talk
Mhm.
about what a model is.
Right.
We
Yeah.
can provide models that maybe give us a little better conceptual grasp of the mystery of the Incarnation, or
Right.
provide some sort of footing or foothold for making some sort of rationally coherent sense out of it, or at least moving in that direction.
Right.
Um, without seeking to say prove this to be the case or
Right.
prove this to be true, if there is such a thing as truth with an uppercase T.
Mhm.
um, that's a much more ambitious project.
Right. Right. So what I hear you saying is, hey, look, ultimately, things like the Incarnation or even the Trinity, these things ultimately are a mystery at some level because of the fact that nobody, I hope, is going to claim that they can fully understand and comprehend God in totality. I think even Muslims wouldn't claim such a thing.
Right.
But you're saying that we shouldn't just throw out the mystery card too soon, simply just by repeating sort of these catchphrases that you'll find in the creeds or even in scripture. We should try to understand the content of what we're actually saying. So, for example, when you have at the Council of Nicaea and we hear the language, well, the Trinity, and this is, I'm just using the Trinity as an example. The Trinity is three persons in one being, or one essence, one substance. Well, that's great. That gives us a starting point. But then what you're saying is we shouldn't just leave it at that. We should try to understand what the content of these words are. And we may not be able to fully grasp God because we probably never can, but we should try our best at minimum to understand it in a way that we can make sense of what we're actually saying. Because if we just repeat these kind of things and we share it with other people and they say, well, what does that mean? And you don't have an answer to what these phrases even mean, then that could be sort of a conversation stopper because it's like, okay, well, where do we go from there? So I appreciate that you're right. The recent work in analytic theology from Christians, I see it as a sort of renaissance over the past, I don't know, 30 years or so. There's been so much publications and work done in this area, and I, even as a Muslim, really appreciate it because I try to understand what Christians are saying and what they actually believe about these doctrines. So I myself, and I also, I mean, I have a bachelor's in philosophy, so I'm toward of that analytic bent, and it helps me to better understand what these Christian doctrines actually are. So I am very much sympathetic towards the entire project, and that's why I want to have people like yourself on this show, on my channel, to explain and express your ideas to a wider audience, because I think for the most part, Muslims, Christians, atheists, whatever, are not really generally familiar with this work. So I really want to get that stuff out there. Now, with that being said, Dr. Farris, I'd like to move on a little bit more into what the Incarnation actually entails. Now, I got a book here. I don't know if you'd recommend it, but I highly recommend this book as an introduction for people who are really want to get into this subject. It's called The Metaphysics of the Incarnation. It's published by Oxford Press. And in the introduction, I think a lot of people can sort of get a better understanding what a model of the incarnation is, what are some of the differences about these models, how do we categorize them, what are the potential strengths and weaknesses of these models, etc. I think the intro does a good job of sort of explaining that. But one of the things it mentions in this introduction is it mentions possible or the typical objections to the incarnation. And one of the main ones is what's called the incoherence objection, which is basically claiming that the incarnation is somehow incoherent, as if it's a square circle or a married bachelor or something like that. So, if you could just kind of briefly sketch what the incoherence objection is and what the concern is with that.
Yeah, okay. Sure. So, so I think we have a pretty good idea of at least the basic data that, let me just clarify before we jump into the incoherence objection.
Yeah.
The project that I'm interested in is both semantic and dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to be clarified or to be distinguished from what some analytic philosophers or theologians are doing with the incarnation, who are basically taking their promptings from a few loosely tied together scriptures that might fit into the Chalcedonian definition, but they're not invested in the Chalcedonian statement in the way that those who are dogmatics or dogmaticians are invested in it.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, the semantic meaning of the words of the Chalcedonian statement become rather important, and how they're used historically in the dogmatic tradition. So you have various people who might loosely follow the Chalcedonian statement and veer off into doing something new. And there's a lot of examples that we could point to. Certainly, there are a variety of those Christians who would affirm the view that when the divine Logos, Christ, as the Nicene Creed puts it, the divine Logos, assumes a human nature, he actually divests himself of his divine nature, which is the kenosis view.
Right.
That, strictly speaking, lots of analytics have held that position or variations of that view, but arguably they're not doing the same project that I'm interested in, really, because they're not falling within the dogmatic tradition, at least not clearly or squarely. They're doing something else. And even those who are even closer to the tradition, some of them are loosely committed to the Chalcedonian statement, but they're only loosely so. They're not interested in so much as clarifying the terms that are laid out in the Chalcedonian statement. So anyway, that I just wanted to say that as a just to clarify something that is going on in some of the recent analytic theological literature. Right. So okay. So so the incarnation, in particular, the incoherence charge.
Yeah.
I was looking for a clear statement. Let's see. Maybe I don't have it. I don't have it in my notes. There's several clear ways to put it. But the idea is basically this. And so if you look back at John Hick's famous work that he's picking up on, and he's riffing off an older work by Donald Bailey, I think. John Hick was a pluralist, loosely committed to a broad Christian view, not what I'm considering Christian in the dogmatic sense, but he was committed to a kind of pluralism. By that, he would affirm something like the fact that there are different truths and different ways to God, whatever God is. There's even different pluralistic conceptions of God that are equally equal or on par with one another. They're all equally valid. So I think you're familiar with John Hick. We're all familiar with famous John Hick. Well, in the metaphor of God incarnate, he really makes much of this idea of the incoherence charge, where he says that there seems to be maybe not a contradiction, although I think, yeah, I mean, he's fine with contradictions in many ways, but there's an incoherence in the sense that when you start saying, like Chalcedon does, or later thinkers say, that there are two distinct kinds of natures with these sets of properties that are incompatible properties, when you start putting those together, there is no the sense of the terms themselves that you're using lose their meaning, right? So John Hick uses the famous example, I think, that you already used, that there is describing the incarnation as God-man, where Christ has both divine properties as well as human properties, is the same or similar to saying there is such a thing as a squared circle. And so that becomes problematic because, well, nobody understands how it is that you could put the properties of square with the properties of circle together, because their properties are mutually exclusive of one another. So the sense of the terms lose their meaning when you start putting them together. Nobody can conceive of what a squared circle is. I mean, you have some modern philosophers who might say, like some who deny sort of these abstract natures, or some who give absolute power to God to do all things that are even logically impossible. They would say something like, yeah, God could create a squared circle. Now, we don't know what that means. We have no sense of what those two terms would mean together, but they would just affirm by the very brute power of God, he could do that.
Right. Yeah.
So John Hick and others who are criticizing, there's a whole tradition of criticizing the Chalcedonian view of Christology. They would say that when you start saying or defining the incarnation as the divine person with a human nature, is both divine nature and human nature together, perfectly divine and perfectly human, in a way that does not detract from the properties of both natures, you're actually making a nonsensical statement.
Right.
So there have been many responses to that set of literature, that tradition. And there's different ways of working out models that show that at least, well, it's not necessarily, they're not necessarily incompatible. We can understand them on their own terms. Yet, if you press too much, there is a mystery there that is hard to articulate, in the way that, similar that, and Ephesians 5 comes up here in this discussion, I think, and it's helpful, in the same way that there's a mystery in the conjugal union of husband and wife that is not fully explicable in terms of, say, material processes. It's not fully explicable in terms of cause and effect. You do this, this outcome comes about. There are outcomes that come about, but there's far more to the marital union than that is explored, at least in a sort of participatory, experiential way, than can be explained analytically. So we have cases like this where we, at least, and this is maybe where phenomenology comes into play and is helpful. We have cases where we can point to phenomena in reality that we, not only can we not explain it, we can make sense of the terms we're using about the phenomena in many cases, if we've experienced the phenomena. But there are cases in which these phenomena are so unique that there's rarely other rarely other analogous ways of explaining that phenomena. Nonetheless, phenomenologically, we experience it to be the case. And this may be the case with the Trinity. If you've had an experience of the divine Trinity in the context of reading Scripture, then you might argue that there is a phenomenological awareness and access to the Trinitarian nature that is not something that I can easily pin down for you and analytically define for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways, the incarnation is going to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
But so at best, what we can do is we can deflect the charges and show, no, it's really hard to very clearly pin a contradiction or an incoherence onto the incarnation.
Right. So
Um,
would you say, Dr. Farris, then, because if we can kind of go into the models and what they are now, would you say that the objective of these models is sort of at minimum not to say what is necessarily true, um, and prove, as you explained before, that the Trinity, things like the Trinity or incarnation are true. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the scripture and these ecumenical councils seriously and incorporate their language into structuring a model of the incarnation that is at minimum logically possible, so that it can remove the charge of quote unquote incoherence to at minimum try to demonstrate that it's merely an apparent contradiction and not an actual contradiction, and sort of like a married bachelor. And that's the way that I understand it. I don't know if you agree. And also, what is a model? Because some of our listeners, or some of the audience may not even understand what we mean or what we're talking about when we say a model of the incarnation. So can you just explain that?
Yeah, so this is actually not always even clear in the analytic literature what analytics mean by a model.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, a sort of shorthand would be a model is something, a way of representing a reality or a phenomena or an event, a way of representing it. So some sort of structural representation of a phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could, in science, you commonly use models, or you put together models that you will explore the viability of how those models explain or capture, abductively explain the data or the phenomena in the world. So you have this commonly in science, and analytic philosophers pick up on this. But I think models are kind of distinct from what you might call versions. So if you have the doctrine of the incarnation as codified or explained, or not explained, but defined or described in Chalcedon, then you might have different models that are attempts to represent in a more systematic way the data of Chalcedon and provide some kind of explanation,
Mm-hmm.
loosely speaking, explanation. But
Mm-hmm.
even within those models, there are different versions of those models. So,
Right. Mm-hmm.
so you might say that. So in the Trinity, for example, you have different models of the Trinity. So, and these often represent different traditions of how to work out the Trinity. There's
Mm-hmm.
commonly the psychological and model of the Trinity, and that takes its cues from our consciousness
Mm-hmm.
as an analogy or a way of thinking about the Trinity, which is very common in the tradition, especially amongst Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. But
Mm-hmm.
then you also have what's called the social model of the Trinity, and there's a variety, especially in recent contemporary analytic theological literature, that I don't think fits very well with the broader Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really all invested in that, but there's different versions of the social Trinitarian model. There's
Yeah.
some obvious versions that we would sort of say, no, that doesn't work. That's not a very good version. Some would
Mm-hmm.
say that the Trinity should be explained as a kind of in a familial way, so that you have father, mother, and son, and so you can kind of see where the social analogy of the Trinity is developed there, and but that doesn't seem to work very well. for a variety of reasons. But then you have other social models of the Trinity. And so you have like these three-headed models. Like if you think of the three-headed dog, or the Cerberus, this is Craig and Moreland's sort of model. It's a social, but also a part-whole sort of model.
Yeah.
Well, that's a part-whole, may be slightly distinct, but they're kind of doing both the social, something that is social as well as part-whole. Then there's so that would be a model. It's an attempt to represent whatever set of data you have to make sense of in a systematic and coherent way.
Right.
That would be a model, and there's different versions of that model.
Now, what would you say would be sort of the minimum requirements for an acceptable model? Now, I'm sure that people differ on that. Obviously, by what you said, some take the tradition and maybe even the scriptures more seriously than others. My understanding is that it should at least attempt to be faithful to the scripture, as well as at least the early creeds and sort of the language that's being used. So, would you, broadly speaking, agree to that?
Yes.
Okay.
So if certainly those are at least minimal requirements. It has to fit with and make sense of the scriptural data, and then it has to make sense of the ecumenical statements that have been affirmed by ecumenical or Catholic Christianity throughout the ages.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, like I said before, I'm just giving a free plug here for this book. But in the intro to this book on the Incarnation, they mention sort of different models. Now, you mentioned one of them, which was Canotic Christology, and you don't seem to be so thrilled with that. What are your thoughts on Canotic Christology? And typically, the passage that they go to is like a passage in Philippians 2. I'm sure you're familiar with it, as a motivation for this sort of model. Um, could you just comment on what Canotic Christology is, and why you don't think it's a viable option for Christians?
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, there's two different versions of the Canotic model of the Incarnation. Broadly speaking, and there's a lot more than this, right? And there's specialists who still work in this, and I'm not a fan of either one. Although at some level, I think the latter is kind of it's hard to get away from it completely. But there's the ontological version of the Canotic model that says that Christ, when he or the divine Logos, when he assumes a human nature, he divests himself of the divine nature, such that literally while he's bearing or instantiating human properties of the human nature, he is no longer instantiating properties of divine nature, such that ontologically he is no longer he's no longer instantiating those properties, because, well, the Canotic, many of the older ontological Canoticists would say that, well, that would be incompatible, right, to have those competing properties, the divine. So to say that Christ would be both omnipresent, present everywhere, and also present in spatially located in a particular place via his body, physical body, those would be two incompatible properties that could not be predicated of the same person. So he must divest himself. That one, I think, is clearly, explicitly out of line with what Scripture teaches about Christ, and it is certainly out of line with the lens by which Catholic Christians have read the Scriptures throughout church history, in their affirmation that he actually does bear both omnipresence and spatially located presence as an incarnate being. And so we have to reject the ontological canonicist view.
So yeah, you would say that the functional, we may be able to give a little bit of credence to, and not say it's so openly heretical. But ontological, you would say, is definitely problematic.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that works. Now, I did have a question because it's something I messaged you about. And this was that last year you published an article related to the subject of the incarnation that was entitled Locke on the Abstractist Concretist Christological Distinction, a Semantic Problem or a Metaphysical Problem. You were sort of asking the question and then you attempted to answer and address it. And some of my viewers may have heard me kind of rattle on and on about this sort of abstract, concrete distinction. It also is mentioned by Hill in the intro of the book I keep plugging.
It's a great intro.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a great book.
yeah,
Is a
it
great
is.
book.
So, I would just like you to comment on that because I've tried to do my best to explain it.
Yeah.
Maybe, and I'm sure you probably could do a better job than I can as far as that, because as far as the models go, what Dr. Farris was explaining earlier about the data, one of the questions that's sort of a live question today, as far as constructing a model goes, is Christ's human nature that he takes on in addition to the divine nature, is it an abstract nature or is it a concrete nature? And if you go with one of those two options, what does it exactly mean? So that's like an open question that Christian philosophers are dealing with today. And Dr. Farris has actually written a paper on that subject in response or attempting to address Dr. Andrew Locke's and you guys may be familiar because I've had a discussion with him, sort of an ongoing discussion with Dr. Locke. So, Dr. Farris, can you just comment on this abstract, concrete nature thing? What are what are these terms referring to? And you asked the question whether or not it's a semantic or a metaphysical problem. What did you wind up siding on in that paper?
Yeah, well, so the way that the literature is talking about the abstract and concretist nature, at least the way I understand it, following Alvin Plantinga's little Faith and Philosophy article, as well as Oliver Crisp and his book Divinity and Humanity, and then just following up on James Arcadi, who originally responded to Locke, was that that this is not merely semantic, but it is the way that it's, at least the what we're referring to is metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has to do with the metaphysics of how we think about or how we prioritize the human nature. Is the human nature a property or a set of properties?
Mm-hmm.
Or is the human nature a concrete particular that indicates or instantiates those properties? And the concrete particulars are what make up human nature or make something what it is, rather than the set of properties. So the example that's given in the paper, and I'm just picking up where Arcadi and Plantinga are, that when we talk about abstract natures as kinds, we're talking about, if you understand what abstract properties are, universals, we're talking about something that exists in some way as universal properties that can be instantiated in different substances or particulars. So you could have a nature such that if we were talking about an abstract view, if we were talking about it, say, an alligator, and we use this example, if we're talking about an alligator that has the abstract nature of being an alligator, you might say, well, the alligator has these teeth that are able to thoroughly crush the bones of chickens. That would be, and in virtue of that functionality, that those properties that it has, it would fall under the genus-species relation of being the kind of thing that it is. Right, rather than saying, if you were to say that, that there are concrete particulars, and that's where we begin, that would be a concretist view, that we point to concrete particulars, where nature is always indicated by a concrete reality, or by even a personal reality at all times, then it has to be, and it is always, and this is probably the common patristic view and medieval view. Well, that's debatable, but
Yeah, because I was actually going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you, and I don't want to stop you midstream, but I was going to ask you before I forget whether or not you think that the biblical data, as far as the sort of the tradition, has anything to say about this distinction, and what do you think? Do you think it lends more credence to one over the other?
yeah, well, when we look at the Chalcedonian statement, and I think Crisp argues for this in his Divinity and Humanity book, which is a contribution to Incarnation studies. He actually argues that the most commonsensical or intuitive reading of Chalcedon is a concretist understanding that there's always a concrete, particular, or even personal reality that indicates a certain property or property membership, and it's not the other way around. That when we look at the Chalcedonian statement, certainly logically, it begins with concrete particulars, and then it goes on to describe those concrete particulars as indicating a certain reality, homoousios with God and homoousios with man or human nature. And so the common sense or intuitive reading of Chalcedon is a concretist view. Now, I'm not firmly committed to that. I think it's intuitive. I don't know. I'm not committed. I'm not committed that it must be that way. Maybe it is that way, and if it is, I think that's fine. I think we can make sense of the Incarnation. If an abstractist view is a possible view, then it might be easier to make sense of certain other problems.
Mm-hmm. Now,
Certainly, my anthropology maybe fits better with an abstractist view than it does with a concretist view.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the objection to the abstractist view that Crisp and others raise, as far as it being an issue of incompatibility with Christ's human nature compared to that of rest of humanities, in the sense that if it's an abstract human nature, it's fundamentally a property of set of properties rather than a concrete particular, in the way that our human nature or our human soul tend to be. And so if Christ is truly like us in all things apart from sin, there seems to be this sort of incompatibility between our natures being and our human souls being concrete, whereas for Christ, it's this sort of abstract property of set of properties, and it seems in that case to be incompatible. This is an argument that Crisp and others who propose the or prefer the concrete nature view give. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So, so I think Brian Leftow in particular has put forward this sort of concern, as well as others. They've put forward this sort of concern. I think if you're going to say that our human nature is concretist, then you have to say that Christ's human nature is concretist. If our human nature is abstractist, I think probably to be consistent, we would have to say that Christ's human nature is abstract, in that he has these sets of properties that make him a part of this membership.
Mm-hmm. So you just have to be internally consistent at the least with your own view on the human nature is what you're trying to say. Like if you think if you think general humanity's human nature is concrete, then it would make more sense to say that Christ is concrete, as well as if you think general humanity's human nature is abstract, it would also make more sense to say that Christ's human nature was abstract. That's, I think, what you're saying. And I would tend to agree with
Yeah,
that.
I think that's right. I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would tend to agree with that. Um, Now, as far as, because I know we kind of settled on about an hour. I don't know how much time you got left because we're running on an hour now. But if you have any time left, I just would like from you maybe briefly for the viewers in the future, because we don't have that much time left. If you could explain sort of generally what model of the incarnation you would favor, whether it be transformationalist or relationalist, I don't know, however you want to term it. What model do you sort of lean towards more than anything else of the incarnation?
Yeah, I would affirm at the moment a Cartesian three-part concretist Christology that is worked out in a relational way, on a relational metaphysic.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably better get going. I would like to continue this though, and we can continue this. We can definitely continue this. That's where I'm at the moment. I think that's where I'm at. That's what I would affirm.
Right. And so, yeah, three-part kind of Cartesian. So then it would seem like it would kind of fall more in line with the with an abstract understanding in that sense.
It seems to make better sense of that, but there is a problem for the Cartesian, and this is certainly we could spend another 30 minutes to an hour on this problem. And I'm inclined to a concretist view, which has an ad hoc feel to it.
Okay. Okay. So that makes sense. Now, Dr. Farris, is there anything that the guests could take a look at that you're currently working on that, as far as research and publishing on, is there anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean, so particularly at the anthropocentric in the anthropocentric arena, overlapping with Christology, I have a chapter where I develop some new things, but it's in my introduction, an introduction to theological anthropology, humans both creaturely and divine. This whole Christological understanding points us in the direction of a deified understanding of human nature, which is part and parcel of the tradition, and that's a much bigger discussion as well. So,
Right.
I really have to go. I'm sorry. Can we conclude? And I'm sorry. I don't want to end this too shortly. I want to hang out more, but I really have to go.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, if people want to reach out to you, where could they reach out to you?
You can email me at joshua.r.farris@gmail.com or on the Academia website. You can find me there. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Dr. Farris. Well, I really appreciate your time. I hope the guests and the audience enjoyed this. Look forward to maybe having another discussion with you in the future. And I wish you all the luck with your further research.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it, Jake. I look forward to it again. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Dr. Farris.
Bye.
All right, folks. So, unfortunately, we couldn't. Dr. Farris had to run. He did warn me ahead of time that he only had about an hour or so to actually get a chance to speak to me. And so maybe if you guys enjoyed it, we'll speak again sometime. I do have James on here, and I do apologize to James. He's a Christian friend of mine, who I was hoping that I would be able to give him a chance to ask Dr. Farris a question. So, like I said, hopefully we'll be able to have Dr. Farris on again in the future. I found the conversation quite enjoyable. I don't know about anybody else. But yeah, I hope that you guys really enjoyed it. James, if you have a question for me, buddy, you can unmute your mic and maybe share some thoughts on what you did see and hear from Dr. Farris thus far.
I think maybe just a good question, a good way you can put a bow on the broadcast would be lay out just the basic level of the incarnation. Just kind of throw that out for him, and then you can put a bow on the broadcast. I had a question for him, but I think it was mainly pertaining to him, but that might be a kind of just a good segue for you.
Right, yeah, because he left, he had to go. So yeah, I mean, I've explained the incarnation in previous videos on my channel. I have a video, it's only about 5 minutes long or so, where I go through, I think it's called Muslim Explains the Incarnation. And so I recommend everybody who's watching to go and take a look at it. But generally speaking, it's basically the idea that the Word, or the second person of the Trinity, became a man in Jesus of Nazareth, as is historically reported. And so it's the idea that God, or the divine person, the Son, took on human flesh, and in doing so was truly God and truly man. He was one person, which was the Son, with two complete natures, one divine and one human. So he was truly God and truly man. This is the idea of what the incarnation is. I hope that helps as an explanation to the audience. And I hope that Dr. Farris, at minimum, was able to explain sort of what the incarnation is, what analytic theology is, what the model of the incarnation looks like, and sort of what the project has been, especially in recent years, as to why Christian philosophers are doing what they are. And yeah, the work that they're doing. I recommended this book. Dr. Farris agreed. He said the introduction and the book as a whole is a great book. So for people who are just beginning and getting interested in these topics, I highly recommend reading it. I've recommended it to our Christian friend James, who is with us right now, and I think he's just started reading it. So I look forward to him reading it, as well as some of you guys in the audience, and then possibly engaging in these things further, because honestly my goal is for Muslims and Christians to have a deeper understanding of their faiths and be able to critically examine one another, but do it with utmost respect, and try to steel man the position as best they can and not straw man them, because if we don't even really understand what the position is, we're not going to have a good conversation. So that's why I'm going to be inviting Christian scholars on here. And as you see, we had a very decent conversation. There was no antagonism or any kind of debate tactics and stuff like that. And I'm planning on having actually another Dr. Josh, which is Dr. Joshua Sijuadi, who I would consider, although we haven't met in person, a friend of mine. We've debated twice, once on the Trinity and once on the Incarnation, but we're still friendly and chatting. We're working on trying to schedule something in the future, getting him on here to kind of discuss a few things, maybe his model of the Trinity. We haven't decided yet. And then I have Dr. Ryan T. Mullins actually coming on to discuss his paper on the eternal processions, or the generation and proceeding of the Son and the Spirit. And that is going to be, I believe, on February 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that should also be an interesting conversation. So I've got a lot of a few Christian scholars lined up to come on here and discuss some of their views and recent work on the subject, in hopes of getting this kind of material to a wider audience. But James, if you're still here, if you have any closing remarks, and again, I really do apologize that I couldn't get you on soon enough to ask Dr. Farris a question, because he did have to run. Anything you want to kind of conclude with before I close it out? Okay, James, I think you are busy, so I'm just going to close this out and say I thank you all for watching. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Joshua R. Farris. I really do appreciate him coming on and having this discussion and interview with me, and I look forward to engaging with him in the future, God willing. I hope that you guys, if you haven't already, will subscribe to my channel, share it, like it, get it out there for others to view, and I look forward to seeing you guys all again soon, inshallah, God willing. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.